The Duke of Harrow once declared, before half the ton and his trembling bride, "Our marriage is a bargain, nothing more." The words struck like ice, echoing through the grand cathedral as if the Almighty himself bore witness to her humiliation. Lady Evelyn did not cry, not then, but when the Duke's empire began to crumble under whispers, betrayals, and scandal, it was the very woman he scorned who would rise to save his name. In gilded halls and candlelit operas, where love was currency and pride a poison, their fates entwined once more. And when she fell to ruin for his sake, he discovered that bargains may bind hearts more fiercely than vows. The air inside St. Elora's Cathedral shimmered faintly with candle smoke and winter breath. 1,000 golden flames wavered beneath the vaulted ceiling, their glow reflected in polished marble and gilded icons. The scent of beeswax and lilies was almost oppressive, holy, yes, but also heavy with expectation. Rows of nobles sat poised as statues, their eyes not on the crucifix, but on the woman who would soon be Duchess of Harrow. Lady Evelyn Whitmore felt the weight of that gaze more keenly than the diamond coronet resting upon her dark hair. Beneath the lace veil, her lashes trembled, though her face remained composed, an art she had learned in childhood when tears solved nothing. Her gloved fingers rested against the crook of her soon-to-be husband's arm. Adrian Lennox, Duke of Harrow, a man carved by discipline and duty. Even in marriage he stood as though before Parliament, spine straight, chin firm, heart closed. "Do you, Lady Evelyn Whitmore, take this man?" The bishop's voice rang solemnly through the nave, echoing between pillars draped in white satin. Evelyn's throat tightened. Somewhere beyond the choir loft a dove cooed, a sound absurdly tender amid the grandeur. She glanced sideways, seeking even a flicker of warmth in the Duke's expression. There was none. When it was his turn to answer, his voice cut cleanly through the silence. "I do." Her own vow followed, softer but unwavering. "I do." The congregation exhaled in one collective sigh, though Evelyn felt only the hollowness of finality. The bishop joined their hands, his rings cold against her skin. The Duke's fingers barely brushed hers, and when he leaned closer for propriety's sake, his breath grazed her ear with words that would haunt her long after the ceremony. "This is duty, not desire." She did not flinch, not outwardly, but her pulse faltered, and for a heartbeat the cathedral blurred. Those watching, the dowagers, the courtiers, the daughters of dukes, who once whispered she was only a Whitmore orphan, smiled behind their fans, mistaking stillness for serenity. When the final hymn swelled, Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Not for him nor for them, but for herself, a fragile armor of grace. The procession down the aisle felt eternal. Rose petals fluttered through shafts of colored light, like confetti of pale fire. The Duke's hand rested briefly atop hers as they walked, a gesture rehearsed for the public eye. Beyond the cathedral doors waited the chill of early spring, and a row of carriages gleaming black as polished coal. Outside, bells tolled. Inside her chest, silence. The carriage door closed with a hollow thud. Velvet cushions muffled the sound, but nothing softened the space between them. Adrian sat opposite her, gloved hands folded neatly upon his knee. "You may remove the veil," he said at last. His tone measured, the way one might speak to a new servant. Evelyn obeyed, folding the lace into her lap. "Is it so dreadful," she asked softly, "to look upon the woman you have married?" He met her gaze, blue, cold, impenetrable. "It is simply unnecessary to pretend otherwise, madam. We both understand why we are here." A pause. The hooves struck rhythm against the cobblestones. "Yes," she murmured, "because my dowry restores your estates, and your name protects what remains of mine." His jaw tightened. "Precisely." Outside the window, the city slipped past. Florists closing their shutters, chimney smoke curling against the pale sky. To the ton, their union was a triumph of sense over sentiment, a practical match after Evelyn's father's debts and the Duke's recent financial embarrassments. But to the woman sitting across from him, it was something colder, a gilded cage sealed with vows. The carriage jolted. For a moment, She pressed her palm against the glass, watching the cathedral spire recede into the mist. Beneath the glove, her fingers trembled. By dusk, Harrow House loomed before them, a great manor of grey stone and ancestral pride. Rows of servants lined the steps, bowing as the carriage halted. The butler, solemn and precise, stepped forward. "Welcome home. Your Grace's home," the word struck like irony. Inside, the marble foyer gleamed with mirrors and portraits. Generations of Lennox men in oil and gilt, their eyes following her as if weighing her worth. Evelyn curtsied instinctively before the Dowager Duchess, a woman whose expression suggested endurance had long soured into judgment. "You must be weary." "Child," the Dowager said, though her tone implied otherwise. "The West Wing has been prepared." The West Wing. Evelyn glanced toward Adrian. He adjusted his gloves. "It is nearest the gardens. You will find it peaceful." Peaceful. The word was dismissal clothed in courtesy. "Very well," she replied with composure. "Peaceful suits me." Hours later, the household slept. Evelyn stood alone before her chamber's tall windows, the moonlight silvering her gown. The bed, vast and untouched, glimmered beneath a canopy of embroidered roses. From the adjoining corridor came the faint closing of another door. His. She exhaled slowly. From the pocket of her gown, she drew a folded scrap of parchment, a letter written days before the wedding, never sent. Her handwriting was small and neat, though the ink had blotted where her tears once fell. "Adrian, I will not ask for affection, only respect. If duty binds us, let us at least not make duty a cruelty." She read it once more, then fed the page to the hearth. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished, much like the hopes that had birthed it. The clock struck midnight. Outside, wind rose across the moors. Evelyn opened the window slightly, breathing in the cold. From somewhere far below drifted the faint sound of hooves, the Duke's horse being led back to the stables. For the first time, she wondered what secrets weighed upon a man who could speak vows without a heartbeat's tremor. But reflection, she knew, was a dangerous indulgence. She had survived worse humiliations, the gossip of society ladies, the pity of men who thought beauty without lineage a form of theft. She would survive this too, kneeling by the bed. She whispered the prayer her mother had taught her, for strength, not happiness. When she rose, her eyes were dry, her resolve set. By morning, sunlight spilled across her dressing table, illuminating the single wedding ring glinting upon her finger. It looked delicate, deceptively so. Evelyn studied its gleam, then slipped on her gloves once more. A soft knock broke the silence. The maid entered with a tray of tea and an embossed note sealed with the Duke's crest. Evelyn broke the wax carefully. "You will attend the Harrow Ball next week. Appear as custom dictates. Do not embarrass me." Her lips curved in a faint, ironic smile. The first of many orders, no doubt. She placed the note beside her untouched tea, the gold lettering catching the morning light. So this was marriage. Parchment, expectation, and the faint scent of cold ink. She turned toward the mirror. Behind the composure, a spark of something glimmered, not resignation, but defiance unspoken. Outside, church bells tolled again, distant and solemn. Evelyn listened until the last chime faded, then whispered to her reflection, "Endure, and you will prevail." The faintest smile ghosted across her lips as she drew the curtains open wide. Letting the morning reveal the world she would one day command, and somewhere in the stillness of Harrow Hall, a single ember, unseen, unacknowledged, began to burn. The snow had not ceased since morning. It fell in hushed, deliberate flurries across the lawns of Harrow Estate, softening the hedgerows and muffling the sound of arriving carriages. The grand ballroom, awash in gold lamplight and mirrored splendor, stood in dazzling contrast to the white silence outside. Within, chandeliers blazed like captive constellations, and beneath them, London's finest whirled to the rhythm of violins and flutes. At the top of the staircase, Lady Evelyn, Duchess of Harrow, paused before descending. 1,000 eyes rose to meet her. She was radiant, every pearl at her throat perfectly set, every strand of chestnut hair coiled into obedience. Yet beneath the smooth silk of her pale blue gown, her hands trembled. "Your Grace," murmured her maid before withdrawing discreetly. Leaving her alone in the moment between duty and exposure, Evelyn drew one deep, steadying breath. The waltz below had slowed. The Duke was visible amid the crowd, dark attire, sharper gaze, posture like carved iron, and beside him, laughing softly behind her fan, stood Lady Cressida Vale, the woman whose name still lingered in the Ton's gossip like an unfinished scandal. Evelyn's descent began. The orchestra swelled as though on cue. Each step she took down the staircase was measured, graceful, her smile a mask polished to perfection. Yet she heard the whispers bloom in her wake like a disease. The Duke still dines alone. She's a ghost in her own house. He hasn't touched her hand since the altar. She reached the ballroom floor to curtsies and bows, all polite, all edged with pity. The murmur of silk and speculation enveloped her. "Your Grace," cooed the Marchioness of Chatham, adjusting a jewelled fan. "How splendid you look. Married life agrees with you, does it not?" Evelyn smiled as gently as glass. "It teaches one patience, my lady, which I am told is the first step to grace." The Marchioness blinked, unsure whether she had been complimented or dismissed. Evelyn curtsied lightly and passed on, her gown whispering across the marble. The Duke had not yet approached her. He stood near the grand staircase, his profile severe, the faintest crease at his mouth as Cressida leaned close. The sight was both familiar and foreign. Cressida, with her golden curls and effortless laughter, embodied everything Evelyn was told she lacked: vivacity, pedigree, and, most dangerous of all, his memory. The orchestra struck a livelier tune. A young viscount bowed before Evelyn. "Your Grace, may I have the honour?" She hesitated only a breath before placing her gloved hand in his. The dance floor swallowed them. Her steps were perfect. Every turn, every dip, executed with the precision of a woman who refused to falter. Yet within her chest, the ache pulsed like a heartbeat. She could feel the Duke's gaze, cool, watchful, detached, tracing her movements, as though evaluating form, not woman. When the music ended, applause rippled faintly. Evelyn smiled to her partner and excused herself, retreating toward the gilded edge of the ballroom. "Duchess," someone whispered as she passed. "Her courage is remarkable." "Or her foolishness," came another reply. Their words stung, but she held her chin high. Later in the evening, she found herself near the refreshment table, a glass of champagne untouched in her hand. The mirrored wall opposite her reflected a cruel symmetry, herself alone and across the room. The Duke and Cressida laughing at some private jest. "You wear composure as others wear silk," said a voice behind her. Evelyn turned. It was Lord Hawthorne, her husband's friend, a man known for his blunt observations. "Composure," she said quietly, "is often all that remains when happiness departs." He inclined his head. "You deserve better than shadows, Your Grace." She met his eyes with calm dignity. "We all deserve something we seldom receive, my lord." Hawthorne seemed on the verge of further speech when the Duke's gaze cut across the room like a blade. The older man bowed swiftly and withdrew. Evelyn felt the scrutiny of that stare as keenly as frost. A hush rippled through the crowd as the orchestra began a waltz reserved for hosts and honored guests. She knew what was expected, that the Duke would cross the floor, take her hand, and remind the ton that harmony yet reigned in Harrow House. He did not move. Instead, Lady Cressida stepped forward, her golden gown shimmering like a flame. The Duke offered his arm. Without hesitation, Evelyn's throat tightened. Around her the room exhaled a collective murmur, half delight, half scandal. She remained perfectly still as they began to dance, each spin of their waltz tightening the coil of humiliation beneath her ribs. A single tear might have undone her, but Evelyn Whitmore had never cried in public. She set her glass down and turned away, smiling as though she had merely grown tired of the music. The corridor outside the ballroom was dim, lit only by flickering sconces. She walked swiftly, her skirts whispering over the carpet. The muffled laughter and violins receded behind her, In the solitude of the great hall, her composure finally faltered. Her hand trembled against the banister as she paused before one of the ancestral portraits, a former duchess, immortalized in oil, her beauty serene, her gaze proud. "What did endurance cost you?" Evelyn whispered to the painted woman. "And did you too stand alone before a crowd?" No answer came, only the echo of her own breath. By the time she reached her chambers, the candles had burned low. She dismissed her maid with a quiet smile and undid her pearls herself, one by one. The silence was both solace and punishment. Then she noticed it, a folded slip of parchment, half hidden beneath her door. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold, precise, masculine. She knelt to pick it up. Her fingers hesitated before breaking the seal. 4 words only, "Do not embarrass me." Evelyn's heart contracted, though not from surprise. She sank into the chair by her vanity, the paper trembling between her fingers. The Duke had not touched her hand at the altar, nor spared her pride at the ball, and yet he feared her disgrace. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, dignity threaded through sorrow. The fire crackled faintly behind her, casting shifting gold upon her face. "Embarrass you?" she whispered. "You have done that well enough alone." For a moment her composure fractured. She pressed the letter to the flame, watching the edges curl and darken, the ink turn to smoke. When it was gone, she rose, crossing to the window. Outside, snow still fell, soft, relentless, pure. Each flake seemed a promise of silence she would no longer keep. A carriage rolled away down the drive, its lanterns flickering through the storm. He was leaving again, she realized. Always leaving. Her breath clouded the glass as she whispered, "Endure, Evelyn. Endure, until endurance becomes victory." Far below, the last of the guests were departing. Somewhere in the empty ballroom, the echoes of the final waltz lingered, and in them, something faint but certain began to stir, a resolve. Quiet and sharp as winter air, the morning papers arrived late that day, yet their delay did nothing to soften the blow. By noon, every salon in Mayfair buzzed with the same intoxicating whisper, a forged letter, bearing the Duke of Harrow's seal. It was said to promise a discreet alliance, a financial arrangement with a foreign investor known for ruinous ventures. To the untrained ear, it was gossip. To the tongue, it was blood in the water. By evening, the carriages lined the drive at Harrow House, not with guests, but with curiosity disguised as concern. Evelyn could feel the shift in the air, the servants whispering too softly, the butler's gaze lingering too long. The polished calm of the estate now pulsed with rumour. She sat alone in the morning room, the light from the tall windows muted by frost. The sky beyond was pale and colourless, as though the day itself held its breath. A single newspaper lay folded on the table before her. The inked words already burned into her mind. Duke of Harrow entangled in foreign debt arrangement. Letter leaked. Authenticity disputed. The room's silence was broken by the sound of wheels on gravel. Evelyn rose, smoothing the folds of her dove-grey gown, and went to meet the visitor she somehow knew had come for her. The Marquis of Redford entered without ceremony, his presence filling the hall with both authority and an almost paternal concern. He was her late father's friend, a man of candour, known for kindness wrapped in iron. His greatcoat bore the dampness of the London mist, and his gloved hands gripped his cane with restrained agitation. "Your Grace," he began, bowing low, though his eyes were sharp with urgency. "You must forgive the intrusion." "I come as a friend, not a guest." Evelyn inclined her head. "You are always welcome, my lord." "I fear the reason for your haste precedes you," he sighed. "Then you have heard." She gestured toward the paper. "It is difficult not to." The Marquis drew closer, lowering his voice. "The letter, it bears the Duke's hand, yet not his writing. I would stake my honour on it. But, my dear, truth seldom matters where scandal is concerned. The ton will make of this what they wish." Evelyn felt the tremor in her chest before she managed to speak. "And what do they wish, my lord?" "To see Harrow fall," he replied simply. "You must protect your name, child. The ton devours weakness." Her gaze faltered for a moment. "Protect her name? She who bore his?" What protection could there be when her dignity was already spent in whispers? "I thank you," she murmured, "but I am bound to him, whatever his missteps. Loyalty," the Marquis said softly, "is noble. But loyalty without caution is ruin." Their eyes met, hers calm but glistening, his heavy with regret. He touched her hand briefly, like a father might. "Do not let sentiment blind you. There are forces in society more merciless than scandal." Then he left, his carriage wheels vanishing into the pale fog. Evelyn remained still long after the sound faded. That evening, the Duke returned. His boots struck the marble with measured calm, but she saw the fatigue behind his posture, the kind that came not from labor, but from pride wounded by rumor. "You have heard," he said without looking at her. "London is not kind enough to spare me," she answered. Her tone even. He poured himself a glass of brandy. The light from the fireplace cast him in sharp relief, half flame, half shadow. "It is nonsense." "A forgery." "Nothing more, Ward. Then why the unease, Your Grace?" His jaw tensed. "Because in this world perception is truth." Evelyn hesitated. The Marquis's warning rang in her ears. "Protect your name." Yet she could not watch him crumble beneath a lie without seeking its root. "I must ask, Adrian," she rarely spoke his name, "are you entirely certain of your innocence? No acquaintance, no correspondence that might have been twisted?" He turned then, the faintest glimmer of anger flashing in his eyes. "You overstep, madam. I ask as your wife," she said quietly. "Not as your judge." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You mistake your role, Evelyn. You are neither." The words struck her like a blow. For a moment she stood in silence, the firelight trembling over her pale features. Then she bowed her head, a single controlled movement. "As you say, Your Grace, when he left the room the door closed too softly to feel final, yet final it was." Hours passed. The house grew still, its corridors dimly lit by the soft flicker of candle sconces. Evelyn sat by the dying embers of the fire, her thoughts turning restlessly. She remembered the Marquis's eyes, earnest, warning, and the Duke's, filled with something perilously close to guilt. At last, she rose. Her steps were soundless on the carpeted stairs as she made her way to the study, his sanctum, a place she had never entered uninvited. The door gave a low groan as she turned the handle. Inside, the room smelled faintly of ink and tobacco. Ledgers, sealed letters, and correspondence lay neatly stacked upon the desk. The faint blue light of early dawn crept through the window panes, casting silver threads across the dark mahogany. She hesitated only once before crossing to the desk. Her hands, though trembling, moved with the precision of necessity. Drawer after drawer revealed papers, trade notes, diplomatic letters, financial ledgers, until one packet caught her eye. It was marked with the Duke's crest, yet sealed in unfamiliar wax. The handwriting, foreign, ornate. Inside were copies of correspondence with a certain Anton Valicourt, a name whispered in Parliament corridors. The tone was unmistakable. Negotiation, investment, promise of return. It was enough to damn him. Her heart clenched. He had written them, or at least permitted their making. But why? Pride? Desperation? She stood there in the half-light, the letters trembling in her grasp, realizing that she now held his fate and her own. If revealed, the Duke would fall. His title disgraced, their names sullied beyond repair. If concealed, she would bear the burden of silence, the complicity of the loyal. The clock on the mantel struck 5. Outside, the first light of dawn spread across frost-laced windows. Evelyn's decision was made in the same breath that her tears fell silently. She fed the letters to the fire. One by one they curled and blackened, the ink dissolving into smoke. The flames caught the Duke's seal last of all, melting crimson wax into ash. The heat burned her fingers, but she did not flinch. When it was done, she stood before the hearth, her face washed in amber light, her expression unreadable. "Some truths," she whispered to the empty room, "are prisons, not salvation." Later, when the Duke entered his study, the hearth still smouldered faintly. He noticed nothing amiss. The documents were gone, the danger extinguished, and though not by his hand, Evelyn, standing in the doorway, met his gaze with calm poise. "Your fire burns early," he remarked absently. "It was a cold night," she said, and that was all. He poured his tea without further comment, unaware that the woman before him had just saved his name from ruin and their house from scandal. Yet as she turned to leave, the flicker of guilt she had seen the night before now haunted her. The Duke would never know what she had spared him from. But Evelyn did, and in that silence a new strength, cold, steady, and unbreakable, began to grow. The city glittered that evening, frost on the rooftops, lamplight in the fog, and carriages clattering down the long boulevard toward the Royal Opera House. London society moved as one great organism of perfume and pretense, feeding on spectacle. And that night, the spectacle was not on the stage. It was arriving at its doors. The Duke of Harrow stepped from his carriage first, polished boots striking the marble. A hand, delicate, gloved in ivory, followed his own. Lady Cressida Vale descended gracefully, the golden folds of her gown catching the torchlight like a living flame. Gasps and whispers rippled through the waiting crowd. "The Duke brings her openly," someone murmured. "Not his Duchess, Lady Cressida," another exclaimed. The Duke said nothing. He offered Cressida his arm with quiet precision, his expression unreadable. But he knew what he was doing. Every glance, every nod, every inch of his public composure was a message. And every whisper that followed was a dagger aimed at his wife's dignity. From the top tier of the opera house, Lady Evelyn did not need to be told. The servants had already brought the gossip like contraband, hushed, pitying, almost gleeful. "The Duke attends with Lady Vale this evening," her maid said softly. Not meeting her eyes, Evelyn's brush stilled mid-stroke. She had been painting by the firelight, lilies, pale and trembling, and for a moment even the warmth of the hearth seemed to abandon her. "I see," she murmured. "Then London shall have its entertainment." When the maid left, Evelyn set the brush aside. The canvas was half finished, but the lilies would not bloom tonight. She stood, smoothed the ivory silk of her gown, and walked to the window. The night beyond was cold and brilliant, the kind that sharpened resolve into clarity. She had endured enough silence. The next evening, snow fell in light, deliberate flakes as Evelyn's carriage approached the opera house. The city's elite were gathered again, gowns rustling, jewels blazing, voices blending into an ocean of whispers. The footman opened her door. She stepped out, one gloved hand holding a fan of mother-of-pearl, the other lifting the hem of her gown just enough to reveal polished heels. Heads turned instantly. The Duchess of Harrow. She dares appear alone. My word, she means to make a spectacle. She met their curiosity with the faintest, most regal of smiles, a smile that concealed tremor and triumph alike. Inside, the chandeliers of the Royal Opera burned bright as small suns, their golden light reflecting on velvet and gilt. The orchestra tuned below the stage, violins sighing like a held breath. Evelyn's entrance silenced the hum of conversation. She did not take an ordinary seat. Instead, she ascended the grand staircase, every step a deliberate defiance of pity, until she reached the Duke's private box, the one reserved for him alone. A collective gasp rippled through the theatre as she entered. Her maid had wanted her to wear mourning tones, to appear subdued. Evelyn had chosen instead a gown of deep sapphire velvet, its neckline trimmed in silver thread, the color of twilight and defiance. Pearls gleamed at her throat. Her dark hair was coiled in perfect symmetry. She looked every inch the Duchess, not abandoned, but enthroned. The audience watched her glide to the railing and take her seat as though witnessing the restoration of a crown. Across the aisle at another box, the Duke froze mid-conversation. Lady Cressida's fan paused mid-flutter. Their eyes met across the velvet-draped gulf. Evelyn inclined her head in the barest acknowledgement. Not hostility, not forgiveness, merely recognition. The moment was so electric that the conductor, distracted, delayed his cue by a full measure before lifting his baton. The overture began, a thunder of strings and sorrow. The opera was Il Perdono, a tale of betrayal and mercy. How appropriate, As the soprano's first notes rose, Evelyn felt the gaze of 100 eyes upon her, the judgment of a city that believed it had already written her story. But for the first time, she was no longer afraid of being seen. Each scene unfolded like an echo of her life. The heroine abandoned, humiliated, then reborn through quiet dignity. She watched, unmoving, the candlelight painting her profile in gold. At intermission, murmurs flooded the corridor. She came alone. She sits in his box. Cressida looks pale. Did you see her face? The Duke stood at the edge of the balcony, his jaw set. Lady Cressida's voice, usually sweet, trembled. "Adrian," she whispered, "perhaps we should depart before—" He interrupted softly, eyes still fixed on the opposite box. "We shall stay. Appearances must be maintained." It was the first lie he told himself that night. The second act began. The aria, the opera's heart, was one of lost love and redemption. The soprano sang of a woman wronged yet unbowed, who chose not vengeance but grace. The music swelled, filling the vast chamber like a prayer. Evelyn's chest tightened. Every note seemed to tear through her composure, yet she did not look away. Across the hall, the Duke's gaze was locked upon her. There was something in his expression now, not pride, not anger, but the slow, painful dawning of recognition. He was watching the very woman he had silenced rise from humiliation and reclaim her name without a word. When the aria ended, Evelyn stood. Her figure, framed by velvet drapes and crystal light, drew the eye of every soul in the house. The audience, uncertain, hesitated. Then applause erupted. The Duchess of Harrow bowed, not to the stage, but to the audience itself. A gesture of composure, of final mastery. It was her declaration, silent yet resounding. "I am still here," and for the first time in years, the Duke's mask faltered. His hand clenched the railing until his knuckles whitened. Lady Cressida whispered something, a plea, perhaps, but he did not hear. When the performance ended, Evelyn remained seated until the last carriage departed. The orchestra packed away their instruments. The chandeliers dimmed. Only then did she rise, her footsteps echoing softly down the corridor. At the exit, the doorman bowed low. "A fine evening, Your Grace." Her answer was calm, though her heart still raced. "Indeed, quite fine." Outside, snow had begun again, faint as memory. The night air bit at her cheeks, carrying the faint scent of coal and roses from the vendors nearby. She paused at the top of the theatre steps and glanced once toward the carriages waiting below. Among them, she recognized his, the Duke's crest, faintly visible in the lamplight. For a brief, suspended moment, she thought he might emerge, that he might cross the distance, speak the words pride had long forbidden, but the door never opened. Evelyn turned away. Inside the carriage, as the city lights blurred into gold and shadow, she rested her gloved hand against the window pane and whispered to the silence, "You will not bury me in your shame, Adrian. I shall write my own deliverance." The snow thickened, swallowing the sound of hooves, and back at the opera house, in an empty box lit by dying candles, the Duke remained seated long after everyone had gone, staring at the seat she had occupied. Haunted by the truth he had tried so long to deny, for the first time, he realized the cost of his indifference and the woman who had become, before all London, his silent judge. The morning after the opera dawned grey and soundless. A veil of mist clung to the moors, and the towers of Harrow Hall stood like shadows rising from smoke. Inside, the house was hushed. Servants moved carefully, as if fearing to disturb the storm that had not yet broken. Lady Evelyn waited in the drawing-room, a book unopened in her lap. The faint crackle of the hearth was the only sound. She had been told the Duke requested her presence in his study without delay. The phrase, delivered in the butler's even tone, had sounded less like an invitation and more like a summons. She closed the book and rose. Her reflection caught in the tall mirror beside the mantel. Serene, composed, yet something within her eyes had changed since the night at the opera. There was no longer the tremor of shame, only a quiet, sharpened calm. When she reached the door of the Duke's study, she paused, listening. Nothing. Not even the rustle of paper. She entered without knocking. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of tobacco and rain-soaked earth. The Duke stood near the window, his back to her, one hand resting against the frame. Beyond him, the fog pressed close, blurring the world into whiteness. "You sent for me, Your Grace," she said. He turned slowly. His face was composed, yet the stillness in his gaze betrayed the weight of thought. "I did," he replied. "Be seated." Evelyn remained standing. "I prefer to hear what you have to say as I am." The faintest flicker of irritation crossed his expression, or perhaps admiration. "As you wish," he said. A silence stretched between them, thick as the mist outside. Then, without preamble, he spoke. "This arrangement between us can no longer continue." Evelyn's breath caught, though she did not move. He went on, his tone measured, almost gentle. "Our union, though respectable in appearance, serves neither of us. Society has already decided what it will believe. I think it best that we part discreetly." Her pulse quickened. "You speak of separation," he inclined his head. "A legal one, if necessary. You will have comfort, allowance, privacy. I will ensure the transition is handled with decorum. Discretion will serve us both." The words, calm and rational, struck harder than cruelty. Evelyn drew a slow breath, then stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "And what of vows, Your Grace? Were those, too, an arrangement to be dissolved when it ceases to amuse you?" For a heartbeat, something flickered across his face, not anger, not yet, perhaps shame. Then carefully he set his glass upon the desk. "You mistake sentiment for sense," he said. "What dignity remains to us must be preserved, not wasted in pretense." She almost laughed, softly, bitterly. "Dignity, is that what you call it? When a husband parades another woman before the eyes of London, while his wife burns in silence?" His jaw tightened. "You overstep, madam." "I have done nothing else since the day I married you," she replied. For a long moment they stood in silence, the distance between them filled with everything neither dared to speak. Then his voice, low and final. "The papers will be drawn within the week." Evelyn's reply was quiet, yet each word cut through the air like a blade. "And when they are, Your Grace, what will remain of the man who once swore before God to protect, not discard, his wife?" He turned away, unable to meet her eyes. Outside, thunder rolled faintly beyond the hills. That evening the storm broke. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the chimneys like a lament. Evelyn sat at her escritoire, the candlelight trembling, as though even the flame shared her unrest. A sheet of parchment lay before her. The ink had already begun to dry on the words she had written, not to the Duke, but to the Archbishop of Canterbury. "Your Grace, I write in reply to the inquiry concerning dissolution. I cannot in conscience consent. Until the Almighty releases me, I remain his wife, in name, in vow, if not in affection." She signed her name in a steady hand, Evelyn Lennox, Duchess of Harrow, when the letter was sealed. She sat motionless, staring at the flame. She had not wept. She would not. This was not defeat, but declaration, her final assertion that her worth was not his to revoke. A knock sounded at the door. "Enter," she said. Her maid curtsied, placing a silver tray beside her. "The carriage is prepared for his Grace. He departs for London at first light." "Of course," Evelyn replied softly. "Thank you, Anna. You may go." When the maid had gone, Evelyn rose, crossing to the window. The storm was passing, but the air was thick and heavy, smelling of wet earth and iron. Somewhere below, she heard the distant rumble of wheels, the servants readying the Duke's departure. She pressed her palm against the cold glass. "So this is your choice, Adrian," she whispered. "Freedom over faith." By morning the rain had ceased. Mist clung low over the gardens, coiling around the bare branches like ghostly silk. Evelyn descended the grand staircase alone. From the open doors of the great hall, she saw the Duke's carriage waiting at the steps, the horses restless, their breath misting in the chill air. He stood beside it, giving quiet instructions to the coachman. When he turned and saw her, surprise flickered across his face, swiftly masked. "You rise early," he said. His voice restrained. "I would not have you leave without farewell," she replied. He nodded once. "That is gracious of you." Evelyn studied him, the immaculate coat, the gloved hands, the familiar stillness that once drew her to him and now kept them apart. "Will you be long in London?" she asked. "As long as necessary," he said. "There are matters to arrange, including my absence from your name." His eyes darkened. "Evelyn!" She raised a hand, stopping him. "It no longer matters, Your Grace. I have already written to the Archbishop. There will be no dissolution." For the first time his composure fractured. "You did what?" "I declined it," she said simply. "You may abandon your vows if conscience allows it. Mine does not." He stared at her, something fierce and unguarded flickering behind his restraint. Anger, perhaps, but also the shadow of remorse. "You would bind yourself to misery?" he asked quietly. "I would bind myself to truth," she answered. "And that, my lord, is a freedom you no longer understand." A silence stretched between them, broken only by the restless stamping of the horses. Then, without another word, he stepped into the carriage. As it rolled down the drive, Evelyn stood at the doorway, the wind tugging at her gown. She watched until the wheels vanished into the mist. The hall behind her was vast and echoing, filled with the ghosts of vows unkept. Yet her spine remained straight, her gaze steady. She had chosen dignity over comfort, and she knew the cost would come soon enough. Still, there was no regret. For the first time in her life, the Duchess of Harrow felt not like a discarded ornament, but a woman unshaken by circumstance. The house seemed to exhale around her, hollow yet peaceful. From somewhere distant, a servant's voice carried faintly, "A letter." "Your Grace, from London." Evelyn turned slowly toward the sound. "Bring it to me," she said. Her pulse quickened, not with hope, but with something quieter, more dangerous, foreboding. The winter season in London had begun, a glittering battlefield disguised as a festival. Carriages rolled through Grosvenor Square, lamps glowed behind frosted windows, and the salons of Mayfair throbbed with laughter sweetened by malice. In those parlours perfumed with roses and deceit, alliances were forged and reputations undone with the same delicate flick of a fan. It was there, amid the chandeliers and polished wit, that Lady Cressida Vale waged her campaign. "She is unfit for society," Cressida murmured to her circle of admirers at Lady Henshaw's soirée, the soft lilt of her voice carrying farther than she intended. A duchess in title, perhaps, but without refinement, without charm. Her husband must be desperate to distance himself. The women tittered, half shocked, half thrilled. The men smiled behind their wine-glasses. Cressida leaned back on the settee, one gloved hand trailing along its carved edge. She looked radiant in pale pink silk, all innocence and cruelty entwined. Yet the faintest satisfaction in her smile betrayed the truth. She was not merely gossiping. She was conquering. Meanwhile, across London, the woman she defamed sat by a low fire, pen in hand, candlelight flickering against her calm, unbending face. Lady Evelyn, Duchess of Harrow, had not attended a single ball since the Duke's departure. The ton assumed she hid from shame. They mistook silence for defeat. They always did. The letter she wrote that evening was not to her husband, nor to a friend, but to the Marchioness of Norwell. A widow older than most dared to be in public, yet sharper than any courtier Evelyn had ever known. The Marchioness had been humiliated once by scandal, widowed twice by greed, and had learned that reputation was not restored with tears, but with tactics. Their correspondence began politely. Condolences, mutual acquaintances, the shared burden of womanly decorum. But over weeks the tone deepened, from civility to confidence, from confidence to alliance. Now, as the embers glowed low, Evelyn sealed another letter with wax. "My lady, I begin to see the shape of the game they play. The Duke's name is threatened not by enemies of virtue, but by those of ambition. His dealings, whether foolish or misled, have drawn vultures cloaked as partners. If I protect him, I protect myself. I ask not your pity, only your counsel." She pressed the seal firm, her crest imprinting crimson against the pale wax. Then she rose and crossed to the window. Beyond the glass, the fog drifted through the London streets like ghosts whispering secrets to one another. Her reflection stared back, poised, deliberate, unafraid. She was not the naive bride who trembled beneath candlelight vows. She had learned that power rarely announced itself. It moved quietly through ink and shadow. The reply came 2 days later, a discreet knock at the servant's entrance. A plain envelope, unmarked, save for the faintest perfume of lavender. Evelyn slit it open with a trembling breath. "My dear Duchess, silence is not surrender, it is strategy. They will underestimate you, let them. When women are thought weak, their weapons grow sharper. I shall see you Thursday at the Norwell residence. Come after dusk. Speak of nothing until the doors are closed." The handwriting was bold, decisive. Evelyn felt a faint stir of purpose ignite in her chest. Thursday came cloaked in fog and drizzle. The Marchioness's townhouse, discreetly grand, rose from the street like an edifice of secrets. Inside, the drawing-room was lit only by a few tall candelabra. Velvet curtains muffled the sounds of the city beyond. "My dear Duchess," said the Marchioness as Evelyn entered, her voice low, edged with amusement. "So the lioness learns to stalk." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Or to survive?" The older woman gestured for her to sit. "Tell me what you know." Evelyn unfolded her notes. Tidy, meticulous records of the Duke's financial correspondences, his investments, the foreign partners whose promises glittered too bright to be real. As the Marchioness read, her brow furrowed. "Valcourt," she murmured, "the same man who ruined the Norwell estates 10 years past. If your husband trusts him, ruin is inevitable." "I suspected as much," Evelyn replied softly. "But if I expose him, I expose my husband's pride as well." "Then do not expose him," the Marchioness said, setting the papers aside. "Expose them." Evelyn looked up. "You mean send the evidence to the Crown Treasury? Let the men who ruin others under false banners hang by their own ropes. Keep your name hidden. Your husband will think himself saved by fortune. The world will never know whose hand delivered his redemption." Evelyn hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "And if it fails?" The Marchioness's smile was faint but knowing. "It will not. I've written to the Under-Secretary before, an old acquaintance who owes me a favor. You need only sign with an alias. The truth, my dear, does not need a witness to have power." The clock chimed softly. Evelyn rose, her decision already taking shape. "I will do it," she said. The Marchioness regarded her with something like pride. "Then, Duchess, you are no longer merely a wife. You are a force." By the week's end, 3 letters left Harrow House under discreet seal. Their contents, names, figures, copies of ledgers, travelled quietly through the city to the Crown offices. The ink was Evelyn's, the courage her own, but no one would ever know. Society continued its charade. Lady Cressida laughed at tease, her voice floating like sugar through the air. "Poor Evelyn," she sighed one afternoon, "so delicate. She was never suited for the demands of rank." The Marchioness, sipping her tea opposite, said only, "Delicate things, my dear, are often sharper than they seem." Within a fortnight, the city trembled with news. Anton Valcourt arrested on charges of fraud and embezzlement. The Crown Treasury had intervened, saving countless noble estates, the Duke of Harrow's among them. No one knew how the evidence had surfaced. At Harrow House, Evelyn received a brief note forwarded from London. The Duke's accounts cleared. Valcourt's dealings exposed. Crisis averted. By whose hand, no one can say. She read it in silence, her heart heavy not with triumph, but with the irony of it, that her greatest act of loyalty must remain forever hidden. Her redemption bound in secrecy. "If he falls, so do I," she had told the Marchioness. But now she saw that even salvation could wound. That night, the servants found her in the library, standing before the fire with an unsealed envelope in hand, a letter she had half written. "Half abandoned, Adrian, the danger is past. You are safe, though not by your own design. I ask for nothing. Only that you remember, not all silence is indifference." Her pen hovered, then stilled. With a trembling sigh, she folded the letter and placed it in the flames. As it burned, her reflection shimmered in the glass of the window. Not broken, not diminished, but reborn in quiet defiance. The world might never know what she had done, but she would, and soon she thought he would too, outside. The city slept beneath the watch of a pale moon, unaware that in one quiet townhouse, a duchess had changed the course of her husband's fate and her own. Spring arrived like a quiet pardon after a long sentence. Soft rains washing soot from London's stones, violets trembling in the gardens of Mayfair, the air thick with the promise of renewal. Yet within the gilded circles of society, forgiveness came neither easily nor without spectacle. The Royal Pavilion Masquerade was the grand declaration of the season, a night when fortunes, hearts, and names were all displayed beneath crystal chandeliers. This year, more than any other, the Duke of Harrow's presence was anticipated. His reputation, once imperiled, had miraculously recovered. The crown had cleared his debts. His affairs were restored. No one knew how. The ton adored a mystery almost as much as a scandal. He arrived fashionably late, dressed in a tailored coat of black velvet trimmed with silver embroidery. A mask of dark filigree obscured half his face, lending him an air of severity that drew whispers and admiration alike. He greeted those who approached, measured, polite, untouchable. To all appearances, the Duke was again a man above reproach. Yet beneath that polished calm, something restless stirred, the faintest disquiet, a feeling that his redemption had come too easily, as if Providence had shown him mercy he had not earned. Still, he danced, he smiled, he played his part, until the moment she entered, the orchestra faltered. Lady Evelyn Lennox, Duchess of Harrow, crossed the threshold of the pavilion beneath 100 gazes. Unlike the other ladies adorned in feathers and jewels, she wore no mask. Her gown was of pale silver silk that shimmered faintly with each movement, the color of moonlight and restraint. A single diamond rested at her throat like a truth too sharp to ignore. "She has returned," someone whispered. Unveiled in his presence, another murmured. Evelyn's steps were measured, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. She did not need disguise, not anymore. The very air seemed to shift around her, as though the chandeliers bent their light to follow her passage. The Duke turned. For an instant, the world narrowed to the space between them. Conversation dimmed, the violins softened, and every pretense of indifference dissolved into stunned recognition. He moved toward her, the crowd parting without a word. When he reached her, he spoke softly, as if the sight of her had stolen the breath from his throat. "Why return?" Her reply was calm, but her eyes shone with something fierce and human. "Because I never left." The silence that followed was not emptiness, but awe, the ton collectively inhaling a truth they could neither condone nor condemn. They danced, not the exuberant kind of youth, but the slow, deliberate waltz of two who had known both distance and regret. The orchestra, sensing the unspoken drama before them, played with hushed reverence. Around them, masked faces watched, nobles, courtiers, gossips, all entranced by the tableau unfolding before their eyes. Some saw reconciliation, others retribution, but only Evelyn and Adrian knew the deeper current between them, the ache of things unspoken. He held her with the practiced distance of propriety, yet his fingers trembled faintly against her gloved hand. "I did not expect you," he murmured, his voice low. "Not after you left me to the mercy of rumor," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "You forget, Your Grace. I have long since learned to outlive the opinions of others." He hesitated, the rhythm faltering for a heartbeat. "You still believe me capable of cruelty?" Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "I no longer believe you capable of courage." The word stung, not in volume, but in truth. He looked down, his jaw tight. "Then perhaps this evening will prove otherwise, or confirm everything," she said quietly. Their dance continued, poised, perfect, but beneath the grace, tension burned like a slow fire. Midway through the waltz, Evelyn felt the full weight of every gaze fixed upon her. Some admired, some pitied, some simply waited for her to falter. Yet she did not. In that instant, she realized that power had shifted, not to those who whispered, nor to the man before her, but to the quiet certainty within herself. She did not need forgiveness nor validation. She needed truth. The Duke sensed it too. "Evelyn," he said at last, voice roughened with something unguarded. "The crown's favor. It came suddenly. I was not told how, only that my debts were cleared, my name restored. You question divine mercy?" "I question luck," he said, "and I have begun to wonder whose hand shaped it." Her gaze softened, though she said nothing. He searched her face, as though hoping for denial, and found only silence, the kind that revealed more than words ever could. He drew a slow breath. "It was you. Does it matter?" she asked. "Yes." His tone sharpened with dawning realization. "Because I thought my honor restored by Providence, not by the wife I betrayed." "Then perhaps Providence worked through me," she said simply. Their dance ended as the final note faded, the air thick with revelation. The onlookers applauded politely, oblivious to the reckoning that had just passed between them. They stood apart now, both still beneath the mirrored dome. "I did not ask for gratitude," Evelyn said softly. "Only understanding." His expression fractured, pride, remorse, disbelief warring behind his eyes. "You saved me, and in doing so condemned yourself to further scorn." "I have endured worse," she replied. "You forget, Adrian, I was your wife long before I was your shame." He looked at her, truly looked, as though seeing her for the first time. "And what am I now?" Evelyn's lips curved faintly. "That depends on what you do next." Before he could answer, the sound of hurried footsteps broke through the hum of music and chatter. A messenger, pale, breathless, still in travel attire, appeared at the edge of the ballroom. Murmurs spread like ripples through the crowd as he approached the Duke and bowed low. "Your Grace," he said, voice shaking. "I come from the Treasury Office by order of the Crown. His Majesty requests your immediate attendance." The Duke's brow furrowed. "At this hour?" "Yes, my lord." "It concerns certain matters recently brought to light. The papers, they bear your name." The crowd stirred, their curiosity sharpened. Evelyn's heart thudded once, hard and clear. "The truth," she whispered, "will not remain buried." Adrian turned to her, his face pale but resolute. "You knew this would come." "I knew it must," she said. For a long, suspended moment neither moved. Then slowly the Duke bowed, not in dismissal but acknowledgement. "Then let us face it," he murmured. "Together, if you will still stand beside me." Evelyn's gaze met his, steady, searching, and after a long silence, she inclined her head. "I will stand," she said, "but not behind you. Beside you, as was promised." The Duke's eyes closed briefly, as though drawing breath for the first time in years, and as he turned toward the waiting messenger, the orchestra resumed, a low, somber melody rising in the wake of their departure. Outside, the night air smelled of spring rain and scandal. The carriages lined the street like black sentinels. The Duke handed Evelyn into his own without a word. As the door closed and the horses began their slow roll toward Westminster, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer cruel. It was charged, uncertain, almost fragile. In the distance, the bells of St. Paul's tolled midnight, the hour of judgment. Evelyn glanced out the window at the blurred lights of London, her reflection shimmering faintly against the glass. "At last," she whispered, "the masquerade ends tonight." Adrian turned to her. "Yes," he said quietly. "But whether we stand condemned or redeemed, that, Evelyn, remains to be seen." The sky over Westminster was the color of pewter, heavy, expectant, oppressive. A fine rain fell, hissing softly against the carriage roof as the Duke and Duchess of Harrow approached the great stone edifice of the King's Council Hall. Inside, torches burned low against the damp air, casting wavering gold upon marble and mahogany. It was a morning made for reckonings. The Duke's jaw was set, his gloved hands steady, though the pulse at his temple betrayed him. Beside him, Evelyn sat in silence, her gaze fixed upon the fog that blurred the city beyond the window. The only sound was the rhythm of hooves and the slow, measured beat of fate drawing near. When the carriage halted, He turned to her at last. "You need not come inside," he said quietly. "This is a matter for men, for—" She cut him short, her tone gentle but firm. "Then let the men learn that truth does not always wear their face." The words hung between them, soft, unyielding and unanswerable. He looked at her for a moment longer, then inclined his head. "As you wish." They entered together. The council chamber was a cathedral of power, vaulted ceilings, a ring of noblemen seated beneath banners bearing the sigils of England's oldest houses. The king himself was not present, but his seal glimmered upon the dais. The hum of whispers died as the Duke of Harrow stepped forward to stand before the long mahogany table. The Lord Chancellor's voice, sharp and ceremonial, filled the hall. "His Grace stands accused of treasonous association with Anton Valcourt, a man convicted of financial subterfuge against the crown." A murmur rippled through the chamber. The Duke remained still. "The documents in question," the Chancellor continued, "suggest the Duke's participation in an illegal exchange of foreign bonds. Should the accusation hold, His Grace faces forfeiture of title and estate." Evelyn watched from her seat among the observers, every syllable slicing through her composure like glass. A clerk stepped forward, placing a stack of parchment upon the table. "The letters, my lord, bearing the Duke's seal." The Duke reached for them, flipping through the pages with slow precision. The handwriting was familiar but not his. A trap had been laid, and expertly. "I wrote none of these," he said, his voice low but steady. The Chancellor's brows arched. "So you claim." The Duke looked up, eyes cold with restrained fury. "I do not claim, sir. I state it." The silence that followed was electric. Then a rustle, the sound of new papers being delivered into the Chancellor's hand by an attendant who bowed deeply. "My lord," the man said breathlessly. "These came from the Treasury Office, dispatched under the royal seal. They concern Valcourt's accounts." The Chancellor unfolded the first sheet. His brows knit, then lifted. "By God," he murmured. "These exonerate him." The room stirred, nobles leaning forward, fans fluttering, boots shifting on marble. Evelyn's hands tightened in her lap. She knew those pages, every word, every line, every careful annotation in her own fine hand. The Chancellor cleared his throat and read aloud. "It is hereby established that the Duke of Harrow was neither aware of nor complicit in the forgeries enacted by Anton Valcourt and his associates. Evidence of his innocence is corroborated by internal correspondence identifying the fraudulent sources, submitted anonymously but bearing the Duchess's distinctive hand." The chamber erupted. The Duke turned sharply, his gaze seeking her across the sea of startled faces. Evelyn rose slowly, her composure unbroken though her heart hammered against her ribs. "You did this." His voice was barely audible above the murmur. "For me?" Her reply came with trembling grace, each word deliberate. "You were my husband, and I could not watch you be destroyed." A hush fell so complete, it seemed the air itself held its breath. The Chancellor looked from one to the other, astonished. Then it was the Duchess who brought forth the evidence. "Extraordinary, extraordinary," murmured another lord, "and most inconvenient for those who doubted him." Applause began hesitantly, a ripple that grew into thunder as peers and courtiers alike rose to their feet. To them it was a tale of noble virtue restored, of a wife's loyalty vindicating her husband. To Evelyn, it was none of those things. It was mercy, offered where justice had failed. When the proceedings ended, the Duke emerged to sunlight breaking weakly through the mist. Cheers greeted him from the gathered crowd outside, the fickle adoration of a society quick to praise what it had nearly destroyed. But every cheer pierced him like guilt. He felt the weight of what she had done, of what his pride had cost. Her hand had saved his honor, yet he had given her none of his. In the carriage, neither spoke. The wheels clattered softly over cobblestones slick with rain. Evelyn sat with her hands folded, her gaze distant. At last he said, "I do not deserve what you have done." "No," she agreed. "You do not." He looked down, shame furrowing the smooth veneer of his expression. "And yet you did it." Because it was right, she said simply. That answer, more than any reproach, undid him. Night descended over Harrow House with a stillness that seemed unnatural. The servants retired early, leaving the corridors echoing with emptiness. Evelyn walked alone to the small chapel at the edge of the estate, a modest room of carved oak and cold stone. Dozens of candles flickered upon the altar, their flames trembling in the draught. She knelt, not in prayer but in weary reflection. The door opened behind her. Footsteps crossed the flagstone floor and then stopped. "Evelyn!" His voice was soft, unsteady. She turned. The Duke stood at the threshold, candlelight glancing over his face, half illumined, half shadowed. A man divided between pride and penitence. He came forward, slowly, as though afraid she might vanish. "You have my gratitude," he said at last. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she whispered, "Then let it free me." He blinked. "Free you? From the bond that holds us in silence. From the weight of what was once love and is now only duty." The words struck him with the force of truth. "Evelyn." He began, but she raised a hand. "Do not mistake this for bitterness," she said gently. "I have forgiven you already. But forgiveness does not require captivity." He bowed his head, unable to answer. The candles between them flickered, casting their faces in alternating shadow and gold. The silence stretched, long enough for memory to breathe, for regret to take root. When she finally rose, she passed him without a word. The scent of candle wax and lilies lingered in her wake. The Duke remained where she had left him, staring into the glow of the altar until his vision blurred. In that moment, he understood the full measure of his salvation, that it had been bought not with favor, nor fortune, but with the quiet strength of the woman he had failed to cherish. Outside, dawn was breaking, pale and uncertain. Evelyn paused on the chapel steps, the chill air brushing her cheek. She looked eastward, toward the faint glimmer of light over the horizon, the color of beginnings. "Let it end," she whispered, "and let me begin again." From behind her, the chapel bell tolled once, solemn, resonant, final. The echoes followed her as she walked away, her figure fading into the morning mist. The weeks following the council's verdict were a season without sunlight. London's parlours moved on to new amusements, but the Duke of Harrow did not. His name, newly cleansed, was once again spoken with approval, yet every praise rang hollow. The applause that had echoed through the king's chamber haunted him still, not for its sound, but for what it concealed. A grace he had not earned, a woman's loyalty he had broken. He withdrew from society altogether. The invitations that arrived in gilt envelopes piled unopened on his study desk. He declined the hunting parties, the assemblies, the parliament dinners. Even Cressida's final letter, a plea wrapped in perfume and apology, lay unread. He had grown tired of noise. Days became a pattern of solitude. He walked the rain-soaked lanes of his London townhouse at dawn, the city's bells tolling distantly over the river mist. He could not forget her face in the council hall, composed, luminous, and irrevocably beyond him. Each memory was a reckoning. At last, the silence became unbearable. He ordered the carriage for Harrow Hall. The estate appeared different when he arrived, not merely tidied, but alive. It was early spring. The fields were green, the air scented faintly of lilac. Yet something more than season had changed. The great iron gates stood open, their hinges newly polished. Beyond them, a group of children, poorly dressed but smiling, played near the fountain that once only noble guests approached. A woman in a plain bonnet supervised them, bowing hastily as the Duke's carriage passed. "What is this?" he murmured to his driver. "They come each week now, Your Grace," the man replied cautiously. "The Duchess is doing. She opened the West Gardens for the village orphans, meals, lessons and such. The servants call it the Hall of Mercy." The words settled over him like slow thunder. The carriage rolled onward up the gravel path, stopping before the entrance. The familiar facade, pale stone, ivy-threaded, seemed both foreign and familiar. It was no longer the fortress of his pride, but something gentler. He stepped down, dismissed the driver, and entered the house unannounced. Inside, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, touching dust motes that danced like gold. The hall no longer smelled of polish and stillness, but of baking bread, chalk dust, and life. Portraits of his ancestors still hung on the walls, but their grim stares now overlooked laughter in the corridors. A sound drew him toward the ballroom, once the stage of their most public sorrows. Now it was filled with low tables, parchment, and books. A dozen children sat attentively as a young woman guided them through their letters. At the front, Evelyn stood. Her gown was simple, ivory linen tied with a faded blue ribbon, yet there was majesty in its simplicity. Her hair was loosely pinned, a few dark strands escaping to catch the sunlight. She held herself with that same steady grace he remembered. But there was peace in her bearing now, the quiet assurance of a soul at rest. He stood at the doorway, unseen, watching as she bent to help a little girl curtsy properly. The child giggled. Evelyn laughed too, a sound so light it broke him. When at last she turned and saw him, her expression did not falter. Surprise flickered in her eyes, quickly replaced by calm composure. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head. He stepped forward slowly, his voice hoarse. "I had not thought to find Harrow so changed." "Change is the only constant, my lord," she replied. "When one can no longer build a marriage, one must build something better from its ruins." Her words were neither cruel nor mocking. They were truth, spoken plainly. He glanced around the hall again. "You've turned this into a sanctuary for others," she said softly. "Perhaps in doing so, I have made one for myself." A silence followed, long and weighted with all that could not be said. That evening, as dusk settled over the gardens, the Duke sought her once more. He found her outside, beneath the budding magnolia tree, the same spot where, years ago, he had first asked for her hand out of duty rather than love. Now she stood there by choice, her hands clasped loosely before her, eyes lifted toward the last hues of sunset. He approached quietly. "I have been many things, Evelyn, proud, blind, and unworthy of your patience. But I was never indifferent. I see now that your strength was not defiance, but grace I could not comprehend." She turned, her face illuminated by the soft amber of fading light. "You speak as a man seeking absolution," she said. "I seek understanding," he answered, "and forgiveness, if such mercy still lives in you." Her gaze did not waver. "Forgiveness is not mine to give. You must find it within yourself." He took a step closer, his voice breaking. "I cannot. Not when every corner of this house now reminds me of what I wasted." A child's laughter drifted faintly from within the hall, the sound of a new world that had no place for his regret. Evelyn looked toward it with quiet pride. "You see," she said, "I no longer live for the echo of what was. I live for what might yet heal." He sank to one knee before her, the gravel biting through his trousers. "You shamed me with kindness," he murmured. "You made me small in the face of what is holy." Her eyes softened, though tears did not fall. "Then be worthy of it." For the first time she reached out, not to comfort, but to lift. Her hand brushed his shoulder lightly, urging him to stand. "Rise, Adrian. What you seek is not beneath me, but ahead of you. Go and do good, not to please me, but to redeem yourself." He rose slowly, his gaze searching hers. "And if I cannot?" She smiled faintly. "Then at least you will have tried, and that will be more than the man I once married ever did." That night, the bells of St. Elora's tolled, low and resonant, their sound carrying over the hills. They did not ring for matrimony nor death, but something subtler, the rebirth of grace. From his window the Duke watched the glow of the chapel in the distance. He thought of the vow he had spoken years ago, for better or worse, and realized that it had never been meant for triumphs or scandal, but for the long, patient work of change. In the quiet of his chamber, he took a quill and began to write. His first letter in months. "To Her Grace, the Duchess of Harrow, there is no penance I can offer to equal what you have already done. But I will begin, as you did, by serving those who cannot repay me. Should the world ever speak my name kindly again, Let it be because you taught me what kindness truly is. He signed it not as husband, nor lord, but simply Adrian. When the ink dried, he sealed it, leaving it on her writing desk for the morning. Outside, dawn began to break, pale, reverent, full of the promise of reconciliation yet incomplete. The Duke stood by the window and whispered into the light. "Tomorrow I begin." The years drifted by like the turning of pages, quiet, unhurried, inevitable. Seasons came and went across the grounds of Harrow Hall, each one leaving its trace upon the earth and upon the woman who had once been both duchess and prisoner there. Now, the Duchess of Harrow walked the gardens alone. The roses she had planted herself climbed higher along the trellises, their blooms pale as moonlight. The gravel paths whispered under her step. The house behind her, once echoing with politics and pride, now breathed only stillness. The title remained hers in law, but not in life. The Duke had long since gone, not to death, but to redemption. He had renounced his seat, his wealth, his name, and taken service with a diplomatic mission in the East, aiding the rebuilding of lands torn by famine. The papers called it exile by honor, but Evelyn knew it for what it was, penance freely chosen. Letters came irregularly, stamped with foreign seals and marked by the dust of distant roads. She kept them in a small cedar box in her study. There were only 12, one for each passing year. Each began the same way, and each ended with the same line. For the woman who taught me redemption, she never replied. Yet she read them often, as one might trace a scar, not to reopen the wound, but to remember where it once was. One spring afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the ivy and the smell of rain lingered on the air, Evelyn stood upon the terrace overlooking the orchard. Beyond the walls, laughter carried faintly, the laughter of young girls. They were the daughters of soldiers, sailors, and laborers lost to the Empire's far wars. Some were orphans, some half-forgotten dependents of noble houses that had lost interest in them. To society they were burdens. To Evelyn, they were beginnings. She had founded the Whitmore Academy for young ladies, her own surname restored to honor. Within its classrooms, no lesson in vanity was taught, no pretense in obedience rewarded. They learned Latin, literature, arithmetic, and above all, dignity. When asked by the Bishop of Bath why she, a duchess, spent her twilight years instructing tradesmen's daughters, she had smiled gently and replied, "Because they will build a kinder world than the one that built us." Now, as she watched them cross the lawns in their modest uniforms, she felt something she had not known in youth, peace unburdened by longing. A soft voice interrupted her reverie. "Your Grace, another letter has arrived." It was Anna, her faithful housekeeper, older now, yet unchanged in devotion. She extended a sealed envelope, the script unmistakable even before Evelyn touched it. The handwriting had grown less steady over the years, but the same deliberate flourish remained in the signature. Evelyn took the letter, fingers brushing the paper as though it might vanish. She dismissed Anna with a nod and returned to her writing desk by the window. For a long while, she did not break the seal. The afternoon light waned to amber. The birds fell silent. Only then did she open it. "My dearest Evelyn, the deserts bloom here after the rains, as though the earth remembers what mercy feels like. I find myself thinking often of the lessons you once taught without words. I've come to understand that forgiveness is not given once, but lived daily, a practice, not a benediction. I have no right to ask it of you, nor do I. Yet know this, wherever the wind carries me, your name is my compass. If God allows, I shall return to England before year's end, though not as the man I was. If we meet, let it be not as husband and wife, but as souls who have both been freed." For the woman who taught me redemption, Adrian Evelyn read it twice, her eyes misting not from sorrow, but from an ache too deep to name. She folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others in the cedar box. Then she whispered, "I do not need to see you to know you are forgiven." Outside, the last light of day painted the orchard's gold. A bell rang from the chapel, the same small chapel where she had once spoken of release. Years had softened the edges of memory. The faces of the ton were gone, those who had scorned her or envied her. Many were dead, others forgotten. But in London, her name had endured, reshaped by time and truth. The newspapers no longer called her the Duchess Abandoned. They called her instead Her Grace, the Redeemer. Philanthropists wrote of her in pamphlets. Preachers cited her as a model of moral fortitude. Yet none of them knew the private cost, the nights of silence, the years of quiet labor, the steadfast refusal to allow bitterness a home within her. One evening, an old pupil, now a teacher herself, found Evelyn seated beside the garden fountain. "Your Grace," she asked shyly, "do you ever regret not remarrying?" Evelyn looked up at the young woman, so earnest, so alive. "Regret?" she repeated softly. "No, to regret would be to wish away the lesson. Love, my dear, is not a crown to be worn or removed. It is the mirror in which we see our own soul. And some mirrors must remain unbroken." The girl curtsied, uncertain, but Evelyn's faint smile reassured her. That spring, St. Elora's Cathedral stood once more garlanded in lilies, the same cathedral where, decades earlier, she had walked down the aisle toward a life she did not yet understand. Now, she entered not as a bride, but as a woman who had outlived both her shame and her need to be seen. The great doors opened before her, light spilling through colored glass onto the marble floor. She walked slowly down the nave, her steps echoing. At the altar she paused. The memories came not as pain, but as music. The vows once broken, the tears once hidden, the strength that had risen quietly from ruin. A soft breeze swept through the open windows, stirring the lilies. It felt almost like a benediction, she whispered to the empty church. It began here, with duty. It ends here with choice. Her gloved hand brushed the cool stone of the rail. And that, I think, is love, not to bind but to free. She turned toward the doorway again, and for a moment sunlight fell full upon her face. It revealed neither the youthful beauty she once possessed, nor the sorrow she had borne, but something rarer, peace earned, not granted. Outside, the carriages of the city passed like distant ghosts. The bells of St. Elora's tolled noon, calm, resonant, eternal. As she stepped back into the spring air, she lifted her face toward the sky and smiled, not the smile of a woman remembered, but of one finally released. In her heart, the echo of a line from one of Adrian's letters lingered. "If we meet again, let it be not as husband and wife, but as souls who have both been freed." And in that instant, Evelyn knew they already had, for she had learned at last that love stripped of pride is not a bargain to be kept or broken. It is a choice, renewed in every act of grace and freedom. Quiet, steady, hard won was her final vow. End of story.